watching this. If you don't know my name is Chris Donaldson. I work as a campus minister for the Cleveland Church here in Cleveland, Ohio. And we are in week 2 of our into the Wilderness Wednesdays of how do we navigate just kind of the new landscape, the new wilderness that we find ourselves in, and how do we be disciples in this time. And so this is our second installment. Our first installment was last week, and we looked at how Jesus dealt with 3 temptations in the wilderness when he was sent out to the wilderness right after he was baptized in Matthew chapter 4. And this week we're going to go back to the Israelites and their exodus, their immediate exodus from Egypt. So I'm gonna start off in a prayer, and we're gonna get right down to it. Dear Heavenly Father, God, we're grateful, God, that you give us great technologies, and God, that you put us in the country that we're in. The people can even be seeing me and hearing your word. God, I pray that your disciples can hear this, God, and really respond to your word, that new people can hear, God, and turn to you, and give their lives to you. God, I pray for a vaccine, God, that you lift the fog of this virus very quickly, God, that we can be with one another, God, that we can hug and touch one another again. God, we love you, and in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, amen. Go ahead and if you have a Bible in front of you, if you're a phone, if you're watching a laptop, go ahead and turn to Exodus chapter 14. So in Exodus chapter 14, so for context sake, the Israelites have just gotten out of Egypt, and right now they're staring at the Red Sea. All right, Pharaoh has sent them away. All the plagues have driven Pharaoh to send the Israelites away. And now the Israelites are facing down the Red Sea, and Pharaoh is coming to get them. And what they do here, we can draw some parallels on, or we can draw some lessons on, rather, about our own life in this time as well. So let's go ahead and open up in Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 5. It says, "When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, 'What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services.' So he had his chariots made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of his best chariots, along with all of the chariots of Egypt, with officers all over them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there was the Israelites marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, 'Was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us up out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert.'" All right. The Israelites are going through it. They're having a conniption, right? Like Pharaoh's coming to pursue them, and they turn to Moses and they're like, "Moses, what have you done? We wanted to die in Israel." They turn on Moses and they're like, "Man, you have caused us to come and die in the desert instead of dying in our houses in Egypt." And the Israelites are grouped by fear, and they're just kind of lashing out in each direction. And I think there's some parallels for us that we can draw from the Israelites' reaction here. The first one is the Israelites, for all their fear, didn't have a really great reason to be fearful. In the chapters before this, in the stories before this, we've seen God, send gnats and locusts and all these acts of God. The finger of God was moving amongst the Israelites in Egypt, and they'd seen God strike down all the firstborns in Egypt. They had seen miracle after miracle after miracle. So why do they come to the edge of the Red Sea and now decide it's time to freak out? Well, what had they get fearful because they've forgotten they'd forgotten what had just happened. They had forgotten the miracles that God had performed among them. They had forgotten what God had done among them just a few days and weeks ago. Right? They did not remember what was going on before then. And that can be the same for us as well. Like we live in a time that is very fearful. Like it can cause a lot of fear. I don't know about you, but a lot has changed since the last time that I recorded this, right? There was no statewide lockdown. We weren't, told to stay at home, but things were just starting to change last week, and things, changed again this week. This time can cause a lot of fear. What's going to happen with my job? What's going to, when are we going back to work? When are my kids going back to school? When am I going back to school? There can be a lot of fear that comes with this time. And the Israelites were there was a lot of fear that was going on right there. There's a lot of things that could have incited fear amongst the Israelites. They were seeing Pharaoh's chariots come and charge them. But what they had done is they'd forgotten what God had done before that. And when, there can be a lot of fear, things that incite fear for us. But as long as we can remember what God has done, not only in our lives, but in the grander history, in the Bible, if we can remember that, we can stand against fear. Their memories were so important. Our memories are so important to our lives in general, but especially our lives as disciples. If our memories allow us, to be reconciled to one another. Say me and my wife have a fight. We're holed up for who knows how long together. So it's bound to happen, right? We have a fight. We go to our separate, rooms. We kind of live in a small apartment here. Our separate areas of the apartment. What allows us to come back together? It's the memory that on December 14th that we loved each other. That we decided to get married. That we loved each other enough to hitch our wagons to one another for life. What brings us back together is the memory of our love before. And as disciples, what allows us to not be tossed back and forth by the waves of what's happening now and what's happening, what's going to happen in 2 weeks later. It's the memory of what God has done in our lives before. There's the things that God has done in our personal lives, right? Whether or not if you're a baptized disciple, and then God obviously plucked you out of the world and saved you from the fire, right? That should be at the top of the list. Maybe it's a new job, maybe it's a living arrangement that you got. Whatever it may be, God has done things in your life. But even the things in our life may be a little bit too small to abate our fear of this time, right? Like, God has done great things in our lives personally, but this is a pandemic. Chris, this is a pandemic. Me getting baptized is awesome, but if I get sick, how do I abate the fear of getting sick? Well, God has worked in history as well. God has worked throughout history as well. God has worked, for the freedoms of people. He God was on the front lines of the Berlin Wall coming down. It is without argument that God was in the middle of the civil rights movement. God was working amongst the women's suffrage movement. God was in these activities, in these grand movements of history. God has always been working for his purposes. God has always been working to free his people. God has always been working for the good of those who love him. So God has worked in the grand scale of history. If we think about our own personal history, And God, packed my parents up from, individually from Jamaica and brought them here. Moved them to Chicago, Illinois. Through circumstances and what we call coincidences, they met and got married and had me, and I became a disciple and had my brothers, and now I'm here in Cleveland, Ohio. That, God worked to make all those things happen. God worked to make all those things. God worked through your family history to have you sitting here in front of a screen or in front of a TV or in front of a phone, listening to me right now. God worked through those situations. God, another place of where we can have a recollection of what God has done is in our Bibles. There is story after story of God's workings. Right, just a couple lines later in this chapter, Exodus chapter 14, excuse me, we'll see God part the Red Sea. We'll see a whole body of water move to two sides, and the Israelites walk across it. The Israelites were struck by fear because their memories were way too short. It was way too short. They could not hold on to what God had done amongst them. What God had done in their lives, what God had done in their history, God in their personal history. Their memories were way too short. And they were swept back and forth by fear. And if we're going to stand firm in faith and not be swept back and forth by the next discouraging news, report, is we've got to remember that God is working. That God has worked to bring about great miracles and change. Not only in our personal lives, but in our personal histories, our family's history, but also in the world as a whole. That God has moved and brought about great good, even in situations that seemed great bad. There's open doors even now, even in this pandemic. We can also go to the scriptures. We can also go to the Bible and see the ways that God worked miraculously among the Israelites themselves. We can refer to the Israelites, the Israelites' history, and see, all right, God worked in a miraculous way. He split the Red Sea. He led them out of Egypt. I don't have to be afraid of what's coming next. Yes, the news is moving fast, and now I gotta wear gloves when I go out to the grocery store, and that's the only place I can go, and I don't know when is the next time I'm gonna even see my coworkers. Are they gonna be there do I have a job when I go back? All these things can induce fear, and all those things are true facts. But as long as we know that God has worked in the past, God has worked through these situations to bring about the most good, to bring about His purpose, we can stand firm and maybe not fear less, but we don't have to be tossed back and forth by the fear. We don't have to stay up at night wondering what's next, what's going to happen next. As long as our memories of God's movements are sharp. As long as we don't take the Israelites' example here and not remember what God had done among them. The second here, the second lesson here that we can take away, and we see here in the Israelites is they begin to complain against Moses, right? And in verse 11 it says, they said to Moses, "Was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the desert?" They got a bit of an attitude. "What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." The Israelites in their fear are lashing out in all directions, right? They're going this way, and they need an outlet, and here comes Moses, right? The leader is always the easiest place to lash out when we feel fearful or discouragement. Who's there to take the brunt of it? Our leaders. And who's there for the Israelites? Moses. And they asked him some crazy questions like, was there no graves in Israel? No graves in Egypt, excuse me, for us to be buried in, right? They needed to leave Egypt, but they had forgotten. And they get into the den, and they're like, wait a second, we need to go back. I don't know what's going on. And they take this frustration out on Moses. And this year was 2020. This was supposed to be a year of campaigns, and obviously there's still an election in November for the president of the United States, and maybe a silver lining in this whole coronavirus pandemic is that where we get a break from the constant barrage of political ads and politics 24/7, and maybe that's a silver lining, but November is still coming, so maybe it's not a silver lining yet. But in times of fear and uncertainty, the easiest place for us to lash out and grumble against, the easiest people for us to grumble against are our leaders. Are the people that are set in front of us, that are supposed to lead us and kind of set the pace for us. They are the easiest targets for our grumbling. We can say, so and so, the governor didn't do this, or the president didn't do that, or the government's not doing this for me. I shouldn't have done this and that and this and the third. It's easy to lash out at these people. It's easy to start grumbling and complaining. I mean, it was fairly easy before to complain against our governmental leaders, but now it's even easier, right? And now it's even easier. And if we're going to be disciples, if we're going to live like Jesus in uncertain times, we've got to remember Romans 13. We've got to remember Romans 13 and the fact that God has set our leaders, our church leaders, our government leaders, our president, our governor, in their place for his purpose, for God's purpose. This doesn't mean that our leaders are going to be perfect. Far from it. They're human beings like us. But we've got to remember that they're human beings like us, and they're traveling a world that they've never seen before too. They're out in the wilderness as well. But what we can't do is become like the rest of the world and Trump's this, Trump's that. No matter what our political affiliation may be. No matter what our political affiliation may be, whether you voted for this party or for that party, our citizenship is in heaven first and foremost. But secondly, God has placed these men and women in the government, in our communities, in our churches. He's placed them there for his purpose, to bring about his will in our community and in our lives. And our leaders, for whatever you say about them, are humans, traveling the same unknown road that we are. What can we do instead of grumbling against our leaders is we can pray for them. We can pray for our president. We can pray for our governor and our community leaders and for our church leaders, for our small group leaders, for our church leaders, Ryan and Kareem. We can pray for these people that God gives them great wisdom and great courage to chart a path forward. To chart a path forward and to walk that path. And if that path needs to be amended, then gives them great courage to amend that path. But what if we're going to live like that? We disciples, we can't be like the rest of the world and simply complain that our leaders aren't doing this and that, and they're this and that and the third, and I can't do. We can't be like those people. But we've got to pray that God's will is done through them, because they're in place by God himself. They're in place by God himself. And God is going to work through them. In a couple lines, here in Exodus 14, God directs Moses on how to direct the people forward. He's gonna split open the Red Sea and they're gonna walk forward, but Moses got to lead them there. He freed the Israelite people through Moses. God worked through Moses to free his people. And God's going to work through our leaders from the president and from the federal government to the state to our local governments to our church leaders. He's working through them to bring about his will here on earth. And what we can do, instead of complaining and grumbling about what's happening and what's not happening, and this is not happening, that's not happening, we can pray. We can pray. We can pray for them, that God's will is done through them, that they're humble to God's will, that they've got great wisdom and guidance to travel the path forward. And so at the end of each of these times, I'm going to have at least two practicals for us. And the first practical you can imagine is, talking a little bit about this at the end here is create a prayer list of all the leaders, that you can think of that includes our federal government leaders, from President Trump to your, maybe if your state senate, the state senators, make a list of leaders in your life that you see on a daily basis. President Trump, Governor DeWine, I think I'm saying his name right. To your small group leaders, to Ryan and Kareem, create a prayer list with these names on them and pray through them each day, that they can have wisdom from God about how to chart the path forward for us. And pray that they have courage to chart that path, to walk that path, to deliver that message to us. And the second one is to create a personal history book. A personal history book of God's actions, one in your life, in your personal life, whether you're someone that's a disciple, your God's act in your life is you becoming a Christian. If you're someone that's studying the Bible, and it's someone reaching out to you and all the things that you're learning about God. Have a personal history of one of the personal things God has done in your life. Two is the things that God has done in your family's life. Now, you may have to kind of go back and do a little digging. We probably got more time in our hands these days than usual. But how has God brought you to this moment right here, where you're hearing from me to right now in Cleveland, Ohio, or wherever you are? How has God brought you and your family to this point? What is the things that your family's had to overcome? The third one is the ways that God has moved in history. Whether that be, miraculous things that have happened in history, the Berlin Wall falling down, or the Civil Rights Movement, or women's suffrage movements, just to name a few, and how you see God move in those instances. And the last one is have a list of biblical stories that you connect to where God has rescued his people, where God has moved miraculously among his people. Find stories like Exodus chapter 14, where God splits open the Red Sea, or in Joshua, where God, take two and then splits open the Jordan Sea. Have a list of stories that you connect to and that can ground you in God's movement. And have this list, whether, that list is probably going to be a little bit thicker than just a list. You're probably going to have a couple pages. And I would have these couple pages of this booklet in a prominent place in your house, whether it's by your nightstand or whether it's on your kitchen table or on a coffee table somewhere, but have it in a place that you can refer to it regularly throughout this time. Have it in a place where you can see it every time, see it and read it every time that you're tempted to be overcome by fear. Have it in a place where you can easily access it, and your family can easily access it. Read it to your family when you guys are fearful about what's coming next. In this way, we can not take the example of the Israelites here in Exodus chapter 14, and we can remember what God has done among us and be confident that he's going to work his will out. This is not outside of God's will. We can be confident that he is working even in this time, and we can pray for our leaders. We can pray for the path that they're going to set before us. We can pray that they have wisdom and that we can be humble to follow that path. I love you guys. We'll be right back here next week, Wednesday, for Wilderness Wednesday number 3. Amen.